To the CARE COVID-19 lecture series. Global inequalities, a pandemic that exhumes these inequalities from their carefully tucked away places. A global movement, hashtag Black Lives Matter, against racist, white supremacist violence that percolates across our societies. These are the times of change. Amidst our close encounters with these deep injustices that have been rendered normative through 5 decades of neoliberal extremism, we must ask, what are our registers for change? What are our ingredients for planting new imaginaries? Perhaps one of the most powerful registers for seeding new imaginations is poetry. Our guest tonight is someone who has, through the art of word making, experimented with the possibilities for crafting these new imaginations, closely interrogating the erasures of the past amidst authoritarianism to articulate what might be possible in the futures. It is my pleasure to welcome the poet activist from Singapore, Teng Sien Si, to the CARE COVID-19 lecture series. In her poetry, Teng weaves the political with the personal, exploring the haunting imagery, the effects of the path taken by Singapore's model of authoritarian monoculturalism. Through her poetry, we witness the voices that are silenced by the state's language policy, strategically crafted to attack the spaces of left activism in the Chinese diaspora in Singapore. Pedagogy in her poetry emerges as a site for seeding carefully crafted interventions, tracing the intersections of national history and personal journey. Her poem, for instance, on history, creates a narrative register through which we journey alongside the exiled politician Lim Chin Siong, and in doing so, witness an account of leftist suppression in Singapore. Teng Sien Si is a poet, translator, and most vitally, a teacher, having trained a whole generation of thinkers, activists, participants in Singapore's social imaginary. She was born in Singapore, spent part of her growing up years in Australia, and graduated from Columbia University with a degree in comparative literature and society. Her poetry has appeared in several anthologies and journals, including Over There, Poems from Singapore and Australia, Language for a New Century, and Speaking for Myself, an anthology of Asian women's writing. Her poetry collection, They Hear Salt Crystallizing, was shortlisted in 2012 for the English language category of the Singapore Literature Prize. Her translations of Chile's poems have appeared in Some Kind of Beautiful Signal, published by Two Lines Press and the online journal Asymptote. I have been conversing with CNC over the past few months amidst the pandemic outbreaks in migrant worker dormitories in Singapore about the interplays of democracy, voice, pedagogy, and solidarity. What I find most inspiring and refreshing about the conversations with her is this notion of exploring the role of pedagogy in creating communicative equality and spaces for voice infrastructures for the margins. Today, we are going to begin the conversation by listening to this activist poet discuss resistance, poetry, and voices under COVID-19, imagining and writing new futures. After her talk, we will move over into the question and answer session. I invite you to post your questions into the comment section, and I will share those with her to respond to you. Such an honor to have you with us, CNC. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mohan. I hope I do this invitation justice.
Welcome.
Okay. Shall I start now?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Yeah, it's a huge honor to be invited to join this CARE lecture series, because I really admire and am inspired by the culture-centered approach and the work that CARE has been doing. I only discovered it a few months ago, but yeah, it's gotten me to interrogate a lot of my frameworks and goals when it comes to activism, and expanded my imagination about, I guess, my own role and the role of my communities and even my milieu, which I guess you can kind of tell from the Columbia thing is a fairly elite milieu, quite Chinese Singaporean, even though, like, okay, those aren't really my social circles anymore. But yeah, that's my background, and I think it's important to be transparent about it. So yeah, Mohan suggested that I talk about poetry as not poetry as resistance. It's note that the title is poetry, resistance, poetry, and COVID-19. So I'm not just going to be talking about the role that poetry can play, etc. It's more like how poetry can support resistance as well. It can be a form of resistance in terms of like just the existence of the text, but it's part of other communicative and voice infrastructures that I would say determine its power as its power or lack of power, or limitations as resistance. So and imagining and writing new futures, that's something I will deal with at the end of my lecture. So yeah, as I said, like voice infrastructures and communicative infrastructures, most obviously being, publication, distribution, like what poetry gets performed, etc., are very key in determining whether a poem can function as a form of resistance, and how it functions as a form of resistance. This is something I learned through my own experience of writing poetry that I didn't really understand was a form of resistance. This was when, I would say the first poem I wrote that sort of taught me that got me thinking about poetry as a form of activism and resistance was a poem titled Casualties of the Efficient World. Before I show it on the slide, I'd just like to give some context about the topics. So it's the subtitle of the poem is Singapore's Bilingual Policy and the Speak Mandarin Campaign. So I should explain those before I start. So Singapore's bilingual policy, I mean a few things. The fact that that English is the primary language of instruction in schools, that a policy was instituted that English became the official medium of instruction. At that time, this was like the late 70s. At that time, there were lots of schools that were teaching in what is now called the vernacular, although I don't really like that word. I.e. schools that taught all their subjects in Chinese, Malay. I'm not so sure about Tamil, unfortunately, or other South Asian languages, but definitely Chinese and Malay. So once the bilingual policy was instituted, these non-English languages some of them became official languages, but they also became just siloed as a subject on their own. Which was then called mother tongue. Very problematic. I won't be going into that right now, but yeah, that was bilingual policy. And it was massively traumatic to a whole generation of both the what we call now I guess the Chinese educated and the Malay educated. Unfortunately, I don't know that much about how this shift into English affected the Malay educated. But based on what I read in Lily Zubaida Rahim's The Singapore Dilemma, it was really like it had also massive like economic impacts, because right before that, please commenters correct me if I'm wrong, right before that the PAP had been encouraging more Malays to take Malay and become Malay teachers, because they were thinking of promoting it as a national, like another like key national language. But then suddenly, nope, like yeah, they decided not to do that. And so Malays who had gone to Malay schools as to train for that were suddenly deprived of like the function the state told them they would have. So I'm more familiar with the Chinese educated, the traumas of the Chinese educated, because both my parents were affected, were like really traumatized. I mean, I would say pretty traumatized by this, because they literally had to switch over to learning all their subjects in English overnight, and so that also meant that their teachers were experienced this kind of shock and trauma, because they had to teach in a language that they probably like barely knew overnight. So growing up knowing this, though not the full gravity of it, I wanted it. It got me thinking, and it got me writing. And the Speak Mandarin campaign was I can't remember the decade, but I think like around the 80s also, was the PAP's attempt to eradicate other Chinese languages that were not Mandarin from the media, from social life, claiming that I think, oh, I'm sorry, I should have like researched this properly, but like yeah, so that people wouldn't be divided by their dialect groups. So languages like Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese were all banned from the airwaves, TV, and yeah, whole generations grew up not being able to communicate. Of Chinese grew up not being able to communicate with their with grandparents who were not fluent in Mandarin, and that was my situation too. So that kind of these cultural ruptures were sort of part of my personal like history, my personal background. And so when I started being more sort of thinking, like interrogating these policies, these and their effects, it became something I wanted to write about. I can't remember exactly what prompted it, but I went to the National Archives and looked at a few like microfiches, and that was behind one of the images in my poem. So I'll read it first, and I will discuss its reception and why and how it became sort of taught me about poetry and resistance. Casualties of the Efficient World, Singapore's Bilingual Policy and the Speak Mandarin Campaign. 22 years ago, my parents began to limp across a road filled with shattered ideograms, reflecting the sky of the efficient English world. 2 days before I was born, dialect storytellers spooled in Confucian values from the airwaves, like coiling malt on splintering sticks, grateful for praise in a prime minister's speech. Now the illiterates die silently in old folks' homes, where someone else writes their name on their death certificate. And in white rooms, children are born each day. From plastic cribs, red birth cries bloom briefly. New name tongues tear the bilingual air. So yeah, I wrote this poem, redrafted it, as you can see, like around June. And around this time, I'd been asked to read at the opening of this art stroke creative writing seminar thing called the Creative Arts Program, because the year before that, I'd won this British poetry prize for young people with and I think Singaporeans will know how much the state still values like validation by our former colonial masters. So the Ministry of Education asked me to be one of the readers at this opening. So the poem I submitted was like about a childhood friend of mine in when I was in Australia. But so I wrote this, and I was like, oh, okay, yep, I wanna read this. They told me no, and I was like, okay. But right before reading the less political poem, I was like, oh, I wanted to read a subversive poem about the Speak Mandarin, the bilingual policy and the Speak Mandarin campaign, and this will have to do. So afterwards, there was a reporter wanting to interview me and about the British prize, but I think this caught their attention because because it was about context, right? It was this official. I guess I disrupted the norms of this official MOE, Ministry of Education space, with Teo Qian, the then education minister, as the guest of honor, by mentioning policies that were not critiqued in the mainstream media, let alone by some random 18-year-old. So yeah, that I think that got people's attention, and definitely that reporter's attention. And one of the things I mentioned when he was interviewing me was that, oh yeah, Teo Qian's jaw dropped, and that itself was like a thing. So was considered like taboo. I was really baffled. I think learning my bafflement about the response to my interview and the fact that I talked about this poem and Teo Qian was what got me thinking about like poetry as resistance in Singapore, because I learned that I was not allowed to supposedly to be irreverent, and that I wasn't supposed to be criticizing these policies. So and I really had no idea. I didn't know about OB markers. I didn't know about all these things because my family environment was very permissive, let's say. Well, maybe not, yeah, but I got to express myself very freely. And so when now I understand why it was seen as such a strange phenomenon for a Singaporean 18-year-old who was been to all these elite schools to be critical, and be critical in a public space, not not just like in private conversations. And I still feel it was absurd, like even like almost 20 years on, and I still feel it was absolutely wrong to do this. And I feel really lucky that that I didn't know that there were these OB markers. So and that I said all this. And I think, so I think this one form of one way in which poetry can function as resistance is just speaking when you don't know that you should not. And I think that one way in which it is very contextual. I don't think it would have been, Oh, actually, no. It might still be an issue today, and I don't think they would. I don't think the Ministry of Education would allow this today. But yeah, disrupting the norms of a space, like of an institutional space, of a very repressive institutional space. So it goes back a lot to context, basically. Like what something has to be disrupted. Like a hegemonic hegemonic narratives have to be disrupted, not just by the poem, but by the act of reading it, or sharing it or distributing it. And this one got anthologized, and people. I think this is still one of the ones that gets, I guess, more attention. Yeah, so I had a similar. Then I learned a bit more about poetry as resistance with my second poem about the Barisan socialist leader Lim Chin Siong, who was detained under the PAP's like mass detention without trial of a whole bunch of trade union and just leftist leaders. So this one didn't get so much blowback, but this was like more than a decade before Sunny Liu's graphic novel, The Art of Charlie Chan Ho Chai. So it was, and Lim Chin Siong in textbooks had been framed as this communist instigator of violence, leader of a party that would have ruined Singapore had they succeeded, had they not been dealt with. So that was another poem where I learned that this kind of re-representation and subversion of dominant narratives was a form of could function as a sort of quieter, in my opinion anyway, quieter form of protest. So I'll read that. On History for Lim Chin Siong, 1933 to 1996. Outside the prison, a radiant young man opens his hands and releases a dove. Someone has draped a garland round his neck. The weight is reassuring, like a comrade's arm. The bird is a little flustered by its freedom, swooping in unsteady arches, before it soars into the sky and alights onto a branch. The young man doesn't have time to contemplate its flight. There is a lot to do, new shifts to balance. Things are happening so fast in his country that they drown out the white thrashing of wings. This only resurfaces years later, after more pain and prison pushes him off his country, and the flashing political days end for good. In his London exile, the boxes of fruit and vegetables he sells each day calm him with their abundance. The people in the Bayswater grocery keep mispronouncing his name, so in the end they call him George. A new name helps him forget the way his country peeled from his eyes as the airplane took off. Sometimes he thinks of another man, the long-faced one with a Cambridge accent and tiny eyes. The one they called visionary because he spent his whole life forcing gold gloves on the digits he ruled so they would not clench into fists. Now he hears that the government has decided to put public money into bird feed, giving them so much to eat that they no longer sing at twilight or move their fattened wings. Yeah, so I was quite a Lim Chin Siong fan back then. I mean, I'm still a fan now, but I wanted to write something that that took him like out of history textbooks, but also it was a response to a really great essay written by the academic Tim Harper about Lim Chin Siong in history, and that really changed my view of Singapore and the implications of having this like Anglophile elite run the country. Yeah, so I think these works were some of my I guess, and the reception, and how many the people who were glad that I wrote this poem, who connected with it. And also, like, one moment where I remember, like, a publisher was like, yeah, I wasn't sure whether to put this in the anthology. I was a bit scared, but I did anyway. So the I would I'm yeah I it still, just being reminded of the climate of fear, even though I viewed my poetry and, like, myself as unthreatening, I think was repeatedly reminded me of sort of what we are up against in fighting for justice and resisting um, oppressive structures. So and however, I do think that the fact that these poems were still restricted to, like, certain readers and certain systems of circulation, like the literary scene, literary publications, only English language readers, definitely limited their potential as resistance. So, and I think one of the limitations of poetry as resistance, or the ways in which one of the key ways in which poetry's potential for resistance is limited in Singapore is the state-sponsored literary infrastructures, the which I think, like, like, it normalizes certain forms of self-censorship, because the grant requirements are really clear. I'll be showing you some of them later. And I yeah and it normalizes the notion that the freedom to write about, the idea that you can't expect to be published or to be given grants if you write about something, like that that it is like inevitable, that it is and that it's not something that should be or can be resisted. And this starts very young, in terms of just the state institutions that determine what poetry, what kinds of poetry will get you institutional approval. So and one of the key mechanisms for that with teenagers is the creative arts program, which I mentioned earlier, the event at which the sort of arts camp where I performed at the opening. It's quite a few local writers are like alumni of that program. Not just myself, but also Alfian Saad and Ng Yi Sheng. Though this was, like, quite a long time ago, but I think that having that whole its entire structure definitely reinforced a very hierarchical way of thinking about poetry, because you had to apply to get in. It was not interest based at all, and so your portfolio, before you had any kind of, like, mentorship or whatever, or guidance, like, was what determined your access to further exposure to creative writing and the arts and writers. And it was pretty much like applying to, the way you apply to a university, right? It's not based on what the program could do for you, but your potential, your pre-existing potential. And the way that mentorship works in CAP is the same. You have to apply for it, and you have to be seen as worthy. I'm going to focus now on how the criteria for the nature of the mentorship program reinforces just a very like bureaucratic way of seeing poetry, which definitely like kills off any potential for resistance. Well, not okay, kills, it really stifles it. You have to go outside to find any spaces where you can read more critical and poetry, and more poetry that's more harsh. And I think that's wrong, because these institutions are a lot of students' first contact with creative writing communities. And if certain things are normalized, like it gets certain restrictions are normalized, it gets internalized. So next one. So I'll just start off with my Facebook post, which I will not read aloud. The 30th, I boycotted the 30th anniversary publication because it was very blatant about restricting voices that basically queer voices, and also that critiqued racism or like discrimination against religions in any way. So I think this is a huge problem, because it normalizes the notion that these even if the CAP, their hands are tied, you can't really do anything about it. You've just got to keep pushing in small ways, but that just like normalizes this a certain level of passivity, like that you can't do anything. I think it encourages students to see themselves as not having any agency or any ability to resist. And for me, like, it's so dangerous to include things like points like not not being able to undermine the authority of legitimacy of government and public institutions, which I'm just wondering if that's about the judiciary, and also censoring voice, like works that articulate like violence to others and self. Like, these are suicide and sexual assault are things that teenagers experience as well, like suicidal ideation. And I mean, these are the to sort of sanitize CAP like that, like, and to tell CAP students that or alumni that these are not acceptable, these are not valid, we are not going to give space for this. Like, it's so dangerous, and it erases like experiences that are marginalized. And look at the last part, like CAP reserves the right to edit or refuse to publish your work at our sole discretion. Like, the kind of that's when the violence, in my opinion, starts getting very explicit. Okay. Some excerpts from documents explaining the nature of mentorship, very very hierarchical. Like, the mentor is positioned as the expert. It is assumed that their feedback is constructive. It is assumed that their literary knowledge is by default more valuable. And so, going back to the ways, the limitations of poetry as resistance, when poetry is co-opted or subsumed by these institutions and these systems that reproduce a very hierarchical way of thinking about oneself in relation to like society or systems. It prevents both the mentors and the mentees from seeing themselves as potential like collaborators, co-creators of and learning from each other. And it also enables a certain like uncritical, sort of unconscious, probably like arrogance on the part of the mentors to to see themselves as the ones who know the answers. And I'm not saying individual mentors say this, but it's something that the system enables. And so there's so many and there's also like the way that control, that even the feelings of the mentees are policed in some way. They have to respond positively to the feedback, and the mentors like have to fill in an evaluation form on the mentees. So yeah, there are ways to so they get assessed on their attitude as well, which and so in the third part that I highlighted in red, it normalizes the idea that there are all these gatekeepers whom you have to please in order to get a platform for your work. And and in order to get your work out there in secondary schools, junior colleges, etc. And it normalizes the idea that like these gatekeepers' judgment is the most valid one. And I think once you subscribe to this way of thinking about yourself as a writer and reader, whether you are the mentee or you become the mentor, you gain enough clout and social capital, and publication, impressive publication record. Like, it's very hard to, I think, to, even if you write politically critical poetry, it's very hard to push back against, or to truly like dismantle structures that center expertise, that center authority figures. So I think this is problematic, to say the least. I think, let's not mute myself. Like, I think this is toxic. So this is similar to the criteria for the 30th anniversary publication. Artistic merit, as creating all these criteria, like reinforce all these false binaries, and doing that, for going back to the way that this stifles resistance, like this affects students' abilities to see their work and to read other literary works in a more in a way that considers context, in a way that considers power dynamics. Because if artistic merit is seen as something that is detached from the subject and as something that is universal, as something that was not created by people with their own biases and with privilege, with wanting to preserve power, it is it just gets teenagers more and more to internalize certain criteria without questioning who sets them. And that I think limits the ability of it trains young people to also see these criteria as these authorities, right, MOE, NAC, as legitimate, and not critique where they're coming from, or critique it but still send in poetry that doesn't push back against these guidelines, so that they'll have a platform, which is kind of understandable, but it's not good. So more evidence of this, ways that institutions impose like this very rigid way of thinking about what kind of work will get a platform. So title, font size, everything also has to fit their requirements. And literally, this is the space, the kind of, they have to fit it, like, it's so symbolic, right? They have to fit it all within like an A4 page. And yeah, do not edit anything after this line. It's so like just like micromanaging the young writers, like until the cows come home. And it trains them well actually for corporate life, which, and the civil service, which, considering that so many CAP alumni go into the civil service, is probably a bonus in their eyes. Okay. So the next part of my lecture is about an Urdu poem by the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, which I feel exemplifies the potential of poetry as not as a form of resistance, but also as like complementing other forms of resistance, and being a means for people to show solidarity, and specifically in this case, like across South Asia. I will read this poem first and show a few excerpts that explain its context and comment on that. So this is one. I'll read the English translation. I am trying to learn Urdu, but my Urdu is not up to scratch. Like, I'm not going to butcher that poem. Hum dekenge. Inevitably, we shall also see the day that was promised to us, decreed on the tablet of eternity, when dark peaks of torment and tyranny will be blown away like cotton fluff, when the earth's beating and beating heart will pulsate beneath our broken feet, when crackling, crashing lightning will smite the heads of our tormentors, when from the seat of the Almighty every pedestal will lie displaced. Then the dispossessed we who kept the faith, will be installed to our inalienable legacy. Every crown will be flung, each throne brought down. Only his name will remain, he who is both unseen and ubiquitous, he who is both the vision and the beholder. When the clarion call of I am truth, the truth that is me and the truth that is you, will ring out, all God's creatures will rule, those like me and those like you. Just to draw your attention to, as a translator, I need to point out that the translation and transliteration were done by Mustancia Dalby, and I got this from, I think, their website, which you can go to. So this poem was composed in, as you can see, 1979, and it has played a major role in as a literature of protest in as an anthem, and it was meant to be. Actually, I should. Yeah. So I will not read this aloud, but the verse that was seen as most critical, which from translated here as from the abode of God, when the icons, and we the faithful will see crowns be tossed when thrones will be brought down, was something that really was extremely subversive in the context in which he wrote this, in which Faiz wrote this poem, as a critique, an oblique critique of General Zia al-Haq's al-Haq's martial rule in Pakistan. So it was the I find it really this poem really interesting because it gained it wasn't the existence of the poem, the publication in his collections wasn't enough. It was because it gained its status and it reached people because Iqbal Bano sang it before a crowd, like a massive audience in Lahore in '86, and it only also could reach people because it was recorded, smuggled out of the country, and circulated. And this was a big deal because the authorities actually went to raid the homes of like concert attendees so that they could get hold of and destroy any recordings of this performance. And yeah, I find it so moving that these words, especially considering the history of conflict between India and Pakistan, like that these words have been taken up by so many different groups, and that they've seen as relevant to so many different causes. And I think, sorry, and I think part of what poetry can do to complement other forms of resistance is to bring in new narratives and new feelings that are minimized or stifled by dominant structures. So love, poetry, dreams, even anger, equality, these are things that poetry like this and rebellion, right, that can so these are ideas and sentiments that poetry can offer if it is able to reach the readers who need them. So yeah, and I found it really interesting. I mean, I listened to this Coke Studio performance, and I found it really interesting that that the video description was like, unity for the people of Pakistan. It was turned into a national song rather than and its history as an theme, an anthem of solidarity was erased. And it's been sung quite a few times during the anti-citizenship amendment bill, in the past, a few months ago, and it's very appropriate because this bill is seen as really as problematic is the wrong word, but as oppressive because it explicitly excludes Muslim refugees and in the oh dear. Okay, I'm not going to. I can't sum up the National Registration of Citizenship succinctly, so please just go and please look it up on your own. And in terms of bringing this talk back to the context of COVID, of Singapore and COVID-19, poetry as resistance, or how poetry can complement resistance. I think right now, I imagine that people are writing, people whose voices are not marginalized, are writing poetry about being in lockdown, about their fears and anxieties, and I think that's valid. And I think that, but whether I would not call that resistance per se, because while I think because it doesn't disrupt the hierarchies of whose voices are valued and whose voices aren't. And if they get circulated in the usual sort of, the literary, usual mechanisms of literary ecosystem, I'm not sure how that resists anything. And I think now it has to go beyond just like expressing oneself or expressing voices of critique. I think, poetry is resistance in Singapore under COVID-19 has to acknowledge and amplify and the voices of groups that have been marginalized. And while I'm going to be discussing Zakia's poem, there are other groups that that whose precarity and vulnerability have become much more obvious during this time. So people living in poverty, and I would say like older people in and people with various disabilities and chronic illnesses that make them more vulnerable, like to disease. So I haven't personally encountered those other voices. So I can't comment on those. But since the huge problem of the exploitation of migrant workers and their absolutely shitty living conditions has become so visible, I think one thing that poetry can serve is to, as a way of, I think one thing that can be a form of resistance is to is for those who are more privileged to share and amplify the poetry by migrant workers and poetry that critiques the systems that led to this exploitation. So I am actually not going to read aloud first draft because I don't know, I feel it's kind of weird for me as a privileged Chinese Singaporean, elite type person to even speak those words that are so far removed from my experiences. So and from what I have to go through. So I will just comment on the parts that spoke to me the most. I don't want to do a further sociological analysis or whatever as a and sort of take on that register of I'm not an expert on any of this. So I think you all have had enough time while I was rambling to read this introduction to Zakia, who is very I think known and loved in the migrant literature scene and also known to and well respected and loved in the singlet scene. And I think this poem is the only. Okay, no, that isn't saying very much. I really like how this poem explicitly critiques so many of the policies and discourses around that perpetuate the marginalization of migrant workers. So these are just I've organized this as 2 columns. I think what I find very poignant and unsettling in a good way is the constant reminders of how bureaucracy is part of this exploitation. The government's orders, how the government's requirements, how being able to meet all of these restricts the autonomy and welfare of migrant workers here. So yeah, some measure the room with tape and count the number of inmates. Often like external agents, government agents, like dictating how migrant workers live. And even if they don't explicitly measure, as we know, the dorms were not designed by workers themselves. Basically, none of the living arrangements are. Yeah, the rules and regulations as a way of controlling, like something is meant. The administration has, that something is mandatory, but the people who are forced to abide by these rules don't have the means to abide by these rules, and are and are therefore made more vulnerable by this. The way that fear infuses this poem, like it it really brings home the day to day. Oh, I don't brings home is the right word, but it evokes in a very the details of the kind of fear in a way that can't, I think, that news, even long form articles cannot do. I've read some really good ones, and I've read some and there are posts like Kokila and Malais who's that describe the way that migrant workers have been treated under quarantine. But I think the kind of imagery and the concision of the lines here just they I don't know, they get under my skin in a way that those other posts don't. But those other resources get under my skin in different ways. So I don't want to unconsciously like compare the effectiveness. I think this poem is it complements the other materials coming out that gives that push for space for workers' experiences. So all the mechanisms and how they constrain and they bind workers, and not just like the Singapore state, but also I thought it was moving. Gosh, moving. Sorry, my vocabulary is not up to this right now. The kind of almost divide and rule approach of even the Bangladeshi High Commission, the community leaders they use terms to separate themselves from from migrant workers, like using language to separate and to make distinctions and to create these hierarchies. The journalists and the literary folks, intellectuals, visit them. So these are the people with more autonomy who can determine whether the writings, the photographs, the films about and by migrant workers even have a platform in the first place. So so I think that it's important for work to highlight that, because often the platforms run by literary folks, intellectuals, they position workers as beneficiaries of their cultural largesse. So that I think that it's important to counter that narrative. I won't go on about the the way that the Singapore state co-ops the feelings and distorts representations of the feelings of migrant workers, the inconvenient feelings, of the feelings that cast doubt on the state are erased or re-represented. And yeah, back to the, this is, I love this stanza because and I think it says so much, because visa work pass structures are such a huge factor in the precarity of that migrant workers live in, that how vulnerable they are to exploitation, because whether they can stay in Singapore is entirely dependent on their employers, and being and occupying that identity of, you know, a migrant worker, and the idea that, like, yeah, if you get at least, you know, the making fun of the idea that, like, being part of an exploited group sort of at least gives you a clear identity in Singapore, is tragic. And it is tragic. And then a date to make them smile, I guess I'm not sure what that's referring to, but like, I guess International Migrant Workers Day, the showing the performative appreciation, and how hollow that is, and how little space there is for voices, including their laughter. So yes, and this is by first draft by Zakir Hossein Kokran and translated from the Bengali by Deba Brotampas. Okay, I've been talking for an hour, so I won't really go into this, except to point out that I want to emphasize that that when we think about how poetry can complement and strengthen resistance against against oppressive states and governments, like, yeah, it's not. I don't think we should just talk about writing, but also sharing and reading and teaching, because creating a work and the impact of a work is never just about its creation, but about whether it reaches the people who will be galvanized by it, and who will gain and who will feel that the poem has articulated feelings, and that they themselves hadn't the words for. And I think that's one of the very cliched, like, points about how powerful poetry is, but it's especially powerful when coming from the poets who need, from groups who have historically not had their voices valued. Because if you see someone who has grown up like you, who looks like you, who has lived the experience of, you know, the suffering that you've endured, if you see them speaking, if you see them talking about experiences, I think it can be, and I've experienced this in my own ways, but like, yeah, you feel that that's possible for you as well, like your own voice, your own actions, that you can give that a go. You can at least try. You can find other people who feel the same way and form communities to push back against the structures that make your voice, that are trying to silence you. Just further questions to sort of round up what I'm what I'm saying, or what I've been discussing. I feel that when thinking about resistance in general, like these and one's own role in resistance, or the role of one's own community, it's really important to consider these questions, which Mohan raised in one of in his very first lecture in this series, right? And yeah, who speaks, and if you speak, what? Okay, no. So who speaks, who participates? Pay attention to who participates and who isn't represented. Like that needs practice, but yeah. And who is erased. And I think for poetry, since the systems of circulation are so important, think it's important to think, okay, who is determining which poems get published? Who's the kinds of people or experiences that keep cropping up in the poetry you read? Who attends these readings? Who buys these books? Who sets the rules of what's considered good or what's considered bad? How were your own ideas of, you know, what's good, what's bad poetry, or like, yeah, how did they form? How did your, I don't know, social circle form its own ideas of like what good poetry is and whose poetry should be read more? These are all, yeah, I think these are all questions if you want to think, I mean, you know, that you need to consider to think about making poetry a more effective form of resistance. Yeah, I don't have like answers to these, obviously, but I think writers and readers of poetry can do more to seek out voices by marginalized groups. Like, you have to make it an effort, I think, if that's not already part of your sort of reading routine. And yeah, I think there are like challenges online, like spend 1 month or 1 year only reading works by people of color, that kind of thing. You can set yourself like challenges like that if you feel you need to, but also like not just, but to bring it beyond the individual, right? Think about how, yeah, the infrastructures of listening and how to build infrastructures that include more voices and validate marginalized voices. Okay, I think I will just let you have time to give you time to read that. But I think the first point for me is I guess the sums it up more. Like, it's when we say poetry, it's never just reading. It's also sharing, teaching, sharing and teaching in ways that challenge narratives and systems that justify inequalities. And so that's not really answering my own the question that I had originally. How does it strengthen more just and compassion? I feel that when oppressive structures are challenged, the more that we challenge them, the more space there will be to make more just and compassionate narratives work, to make them heard. I don't I don't really want to like state what just and compassionate narratives are, because I think the word just already it's about justice, narratives that center justice and equity, and also compassion, where marginalized groups are not seen as beneficiaries, recipients of charity, where they, to use a lot of culture-centered terminology, where they co-create these spaces, where they co-create the ways in which sharing, reading, and teaching of poetry is done. And yeah, like other as with we saw with whom the Kenge, other artists and other activists can also if distribute and share poetry that can support, that articulates things about what they're working for. Other artists can adapt or popularize poetry beyond their usual beyond the sort of literary ecosystem and usual infrastructures. Yeah, so it is a collaborative thing. Like it's not just poets for social justice, but it's poets as part of a community of activists and other people who may not identify as such, but who also are working for social justice. And yes, that's why poets, publishers, and literary organizers need to act in solidarity with activists and marginalized groups, and that requires a lot of self-reflection. Okay. Yeah, and yes, I will end with a poem that I wrote much more recently, which is, I think, which is dedicated to my dear friend Jolovan, who has recently been through a lot, and you can go to his, I shall not sum up his how the state has is trying to silence him, but yeah, you can go to his Facebook page for that or Google him. And I'm really glad he liked it. I liked this poem a lot. So, the political history of Singapore under the PAP for Jolovan Wam. Say, then don't do. Don't do, then still say. Still do, then don't say. Do, then still dare to say. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation, and I love how you started with sort of reading your very own personal poetry, and then moving into the context of migrant worker voices, and then wrapping up with your solidarity poem with Jolovan. So, one of the questions I wanted to begin by asking you is something you said in the very beginning, which was that when you were initially writing the poetry on the language policy, you really weren't thinking of it as resistance poetry. I thought that part was, very interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I thought that it was just because I was I was pretty oblivious to the to these histories, and obviously the history of language policy was not actually taught in my history syllabus, and I only sort of knew about it from stories my parents told me. I did not know that in sort of mainstream media, any critique of it was a taboo. I was not really reading news at that time, so combine that with a family environment that that pretty much allowed me to say what I wanted, to argue back. I had no clue that I wasn't supposed to criticize authority figures or what they did. Yeah, I mean, obviously being in school, you know how to obey school rules and all that, but yeah, I didn't know that I couldn't say that. And I hadn't, yeah, and I saw absolutely no reason why I couldn't have read the poem, why I couldn't have told reporters that Teo Chee Hean's jaw dropped, I actually got told by an MOE officer that that I could have caused someone to lose their job for just repeating this amusing anecdote. But I hadn't internalized any of that, and so that's why I didn't think of that poem as any form of resistance. Yeah.
So it seems like there is a lesson right there, because on one hand you talk about this real climate of fear that is cultivated very carefully and strategically, and on the other hand it seems like a certain level of innocence, if you're able to maintain that kind of innocence or cultivate it, is one way for nurturing a resistance or transformative possibilities.
Yeah, and I think that this innocence, or I don't want to call it naivety because that always seems like a criticism or like insulting in some way. But this the fact that I was insulated from like OB markers in general was also due to the fact that I wasn't very critical of the practices and discourses in my school. So I hadn't bumped up against authorities, and my main, I guess, authority figures were like at home, and like yeah, my parents gave me a lot of freedom. So that was really internalized, like my right to that, and yeah, and so that this combination of factors, like it's basically serendipity, right, that allowed me to yeah, and having those conditions are so important. Like that's why like the conditions are so important, and that's why like the all these the bureaucratic, rigid, restrictive crap that the creative arts program is has codified now is bad, because it's another reminder that normalizes like censorship and self-censorship. Yeah. So the fewer reminders you have of that, the easier it is to express critical opinions, because you won't have you won't have like internalized the belief that you should be careful. Yeah. I don't think I've really internalized that even now, but yeah, okay. Maybe a bit more, but yeah.
So, one of the things that you and I have often discussed is how you try to bring sort of some of this philosophy into your teaching or into your pedagogy.
Yeah.
I would love to hear how you do that.
Oh, I will have to make sure I don't go on for too long about that, because because I have so much to say. And I've been a private tutor in the so-called shadow industry of Singapore education for the last about 7 years now, and I think that that has been a really good space to develop these pedagogies, because you do have that one-on-one interaction on a regular basis, and so like you get a lot of chances to practice making to figure out how to make different how to make different students feel safe to express themselves, and that requires a lot of uh, requires you to be really intentional about the language and about the feelings you express when they say something. So the example I'd like to cite is that if they tell you about something that's like a big deal, even if you have no clue why it's a big deal and it feels very trivial, right? Like it's important to validate their feelings. And I think that and give them the space to talk about that. So one key pedagogical strategy is not to get too caught up in, oh no, I need to spend X percentage of time on the lesson, on the curriculum, and give students space to talk. And then that safety goes, that safety also allows them to to engage in discussions and think aloud about social political structures, oppressive systems, and yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I don't pretend there's no such thing as being unbiased, but I'm also very intentional about exposing exposing students to materials like new narrative and other other sort of resources about these ideas and sharing my own experience. But I think the important thing to almost like retain this, sorry for the coughing, retain this innocence in the, not retain, but to reinforce their belief that they have the right to speak, is to provide this space every week where they know that they'll be validated, but not uncritically. So so they don't they feel safe, because while I will validate, I won't pretend to, you know, I won't pretend to understand. I will be honest, but in a way that is I guess, yeah, in a way that doesn't invalidate them. So I think safety is really safety and space are really important. Yeah. And I think many, oh sorry, yeah, I think many tutors will know this, but yeah, often tutors become like a quasi therapist, because especially if the students' parents are not particularly encouraging or interested in their concerns. So so yeah, that kind of emotional engagement and is also important in normalizing the belief that they have the right to feel things and to say things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to say that seems like, you know, the work of building voice infrastructures within pedagogy.
Yeah, because it's so, I've gotten quite a few Teachers' Day notes I've gotten thank me for asking for their feedback, and that got me thinking. And we've talked about this, but if we're talking about voice infrastructures, even though the students from elite schools that I teach are going to go on to, many are going to go on to positions of power and influence, like within the school, there is a massive, like, they have no real voice. Like, whatever student congress, like whatever campaigns they set up, like they have no real power to veto or to challenge any school policies. So while they are most of them are massively privileged in relation to the rest of society, like they do know what it's like to have no agency in the face of like the juggernaut of an institution. Yeah, so I think that tutoring them offers a space where they will be listened to, their complaints will be listened to, and I try to encourage them to like, if it's a complaint that's shared by multiple people, for example, about like an unprofessional teacher or an incompetent teacher, I'm just like, why don't you get some people together, you know, who can corroborate your experience, and then submit a complaint or something, or yeah. So stuff like that. I think just having that regular space, that oasis, hopefully, please, former students, tell me if I want that oasis where they can speak and be heard. And also, oh yeah, I give them a lot of agency over like how much homework that I give, and they pretty much get to decide what we are doing at any given session, because I don't see the point of boring students. They're not going to learn very well if you know, I unilaterally decide what they want to do. Yeah. So that kind of agency, the bodily experience of having agency and voice, even if it's within like expensive tuition. Yeah.
I will connect this to a question that one of our audience members has asked. This is a question from Samuel, who says, you mentioned shortcomings, the CAP program earlier, and I was wondering what you see are the steps forward from here, both within such programs and the education system. What kinds of reforms should take place? How can we push for change and empowerment in a system that is known for being risk averse and gatekeeping?
Okay, so I will just think aloud. First of all, I don't see the point of pushing for change and empowerment in a system within the CAP system at all. It's been 20 years since I was there in 98 and 2000, and it's just gotten more restrictive since then. Like, we really didn't have those NAC guidelines. I can't really, it's so disgusting. Anyway, and I have met and interacted with and had good interactions with many MOE officers who are in their private capacity encouraging of self-expression, all this kind of thing, but who do not push for, or okay, I don't say what they do in their interactions with MOE, but whose efforts have not resulted in any loosening up of these restrictions. So I think the important thing is to actually set up other communities, other ways, other accessible ways for teenagers to, and I think these exist, but teenagers to share their writing, to get encouragement, to get feedback, and communities that are not based on competition. That's my kind of main issue, the big issue I have with Singapore Rimo, which is that the algorithms and the number of likes determines which poems are more visible. So I feel that you have to work. People who are rewarded by the current literary ecosystem, and I include myself, need to be more willing to need to set up alternative systems that do not depend on state validation. So I just don't within the education system, I'm quite pessimistic about this, because I think that there has been minimal progress, but I think there's so much. I think teachers and educators feel that there's so much at stake for them if they challenge it in significant ways. And MOE uses basically a lot of admin, bureaucracy, and risk-averse people at various levels of administration. So to narrow the potential of education. So I think external collective modes of education, there's a Facebook group, a community called Community Classroom, which is going to organize an event on, I think, climate change and climate justice and education. So events that take place outside of school. So I feel that it has to be ground up, because much as educators in MOE want to change things, it's the sort of intricate mechanisms of control will, and just the whole basis of the competitiveness, the standardized assessment, it undermines a lot of individual efforts, or even department-based efforts. So quite bleak, basically.
So there's a question that I think nicely dovetails with this, which is, as a tutor, how do you balance the need of training students to do well on a restrictive curriculum and exposing students to alternative viewpoints?
I don't know whether I know who this person is, and I don't know whether I should expose their identity. Yeah, it's really it's it's difficult because I think sometimes like my the only reason that I feel like I need to um, train students to to do well on standardized assessments is so that I won't be fired, so that I will still get to like engage with these students. So I think my starting principle is how can we minimize the time that we spend on standardized assessments, but also how to use the development of these skills as starting points to critique the need for these skills, but and also to expose students to like social justice ideas and be critical of systems. So, for example, like talking about so if I'm teaching like poetry comparison skills for a literature exam, right, comparing two poems, I can use it to start as a starting point to discuss like the need to examine a poem in context, even though they're not going to be writing about that, and the need to examine like what assumptions the poem is making about what's good, what's bad, what's valuable, the position of the speaker, what their demographic might what biases their demographic might have. And so using the curriculum as starting points, and for me constantly being very meta about the curriculum, like constantly critiquing the ways, exposing the ways in which their curriculum is restrictive, it doesn't assess what it's ostensibly supposed to assess, etc. So treating the curriculum as an object of critique as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to ask a little bit about your reading and learning Urdu. I find that really fascinating, and particularly, your reference to Hum Dekhenge and its uh, revolutionary potential, really. So let me ask you this. Do you see a poem like Hum Dekhenge, which has so much disruptive power within the context of South Asia, be it within the context of Pakistan or in India in the protest movement? Do you see that flowing into Singapore and opening up possibilities? That kind of a register?
First of all, I'm sure that such poems exist already and have existed, but um, I I suspect that most poems that call for revolution and the overthrowing of power, that explicitly call for that, are not published, or B, like published in platforms that are outside the mainstream Singapore English literary establishment. Or even if the poets are from that, circle, like, it might just not have gotten more attention because certain kind of registers for are more privileged, and yeah, and so so I don't So I don't know. I don't see that happening anytime soon, I think. And yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon, unless without like big changes in voice infrastructures, in literary infrastructures. And yeah, I don't know how that's going to happen. And I just feel that like I also feel that like Singaporean activism still doesn't have a very internationalist or regional like strain. So, and because of so I'm not sure if I see poetry as a way that to strengthen like internationalist solidarities. Yeah, not right now anyway. I need to go think about this. This is a really good question. Like, what is the potential, or is there what kind of what a sort of whom the Kenge would be the Kenge would look like here.
Yeah, another question I wanted to ask is with your reading of Zakir's poem. And I think, what's interesting is that when you look at the expressions of migrant worker agency within the context of COVID-19 even, but of course, much before that, and with the history that predates the contemporary outbreak, you juxtapose that in the backdrop of sort of these elite discursive constructions. And I will just give you one example. I was reading the other day an exchange between two white interlocutors, talking about migrant worker poetry, and sort of framing it as if it is some kind of distraction that takes away from activism and real change. And what struck me there is sort of the fundamental inequality in these discursive spaces that fail to see the agentic expressions of workers, even when those are being articulated. I would love to hear your comment on that.
I think it would. I think this goes back to the broader problem here, which I've noticed more and more because I'm tuning in more and more to like webinars, panels on migrant workers' rights and issues under COVID-19, and reading more and more articles is something that Jolivin has pointed out to me as well. Like, there's a lot of speaking for, and not a lot of these panels include workers' voices themselves, the voices of workers themselves, and I think it goes back to the problem of how Singapore, especially with this very technocratic government, values it worships certain forms of expertise, or it frames certain forms of knowledge as expertise and others as, like, I don't know, feedback or whatever. And I think that as long as that happens, like the agency of workers and the validity of what they say will be seen as lesser than those of experts. So I think what I would like to see is a sort of, I guess, larger version of what the CARE white papers try to do, which is more platforms for more workers to express their ideas and feelings about what's going on and what can happen, what can be done what should be done to solve the current many problems. Yeah, and I think that this cult of expertise is also what devalues creative expression as a form of agency, in a form of critique, because you could, like, Zaki's poem, like First Draft, like articulates, it's why is it not seen as authoritative as like an academic paper? There's no like real reason for that. And I'm not saying academic papers don't have credibility, but why are they so valued above poetry that exposes the same problems?
Mhm. So in that sense, I guess poetry as resistance is also undoing the register of what is valuable and what isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it disrupts that the hierarchy that I think is particularly I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about like South Asian registers to say, but like, yeah, it's particularly pernicious in Singapore because of the way that the PAP represents its recruitment processes and the credentials of its ministers. Expertise is given so much weight, and it's only a certain form of expertise, and as if like paper qualifications give you expertise on like a wide range of lived experiences, when in fact having those qualifications is often what limits one's expertise or any understanding of the experience of marginalized voices. Yep.
Yes, I mean that in itself is so powerful, right? It seems like within the context of COVID-19, for instance, the sort of expertise that gets in the way, and really blinds oneself to be able to actually anticipate even what might be happening.
Yeah, like the whole like hindsight, whatever. I mean, that's not that's because they didn't listen to like literally like a decade plus of even NGOs who are still speaking for, but certainly at least have much more proximity with
Yes.
those groups. And I think that's why I feel that like Kokila's posts, like with pictures and with like quotes from migrant workers, are so powerful, because they're social media posts which are often like devalued as less credible.
Right.
But they're but her posts are like way more credible, because first of all, she has been really transparent about her sources, but also because they come directly from workers who don't from workers themselves, like quoting like photos taken by them, not for them. And so I love how that while not being like poetry or like artistic creation, but how that disrupts the notion that institutions, government agencies are best at diagnosing and identifying problems. Yeah.
Yep. And also, of course, that politics of evidence making, as you bring it up, is really interesting. Because, on one hand, while particular Facebook posts get devalued, other Facebook posts that seemingly support the state narrative get drawn into the parliament and get propped up as the evidence.
Yeah.
Of course, the way to then simply carry out the propaganda rather than listening to what's coming from the ground as based on empirical evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the other thing. Oh, I guess this kind of links to also poetry as resistance, and something that Koki said in her lecture about her position, which the question to ask I think, is questions to ask. Who does this narrative threaten and who does it comfort? I think these questions are also very powerful when we evaluate whether a poem is a form of resistance. And this is not saying that comfort is bad, like narratives that comfort are inherently bad, but being more specific about who might be comforted by these and who might be erased, and thinking about whether a poem that you're reading or writing threatens an oppressive narrative. I think these are questions, these are all helpful questions, and also questions to ask of evidence, of academic papers, of articles. Yeah.
Beautiful. Here's another question from an audience, CNC, who asks, how do you reconcile the inherent flaws in the tuition industry, which was created out of demand for unequal access in education, with your social justice beliefs?
Oh, yeah, this is, I felt, I used to feel a lot more guilt about this, because but now I think of it in terms of like, okay, as an educator who wants to I guess raise questions of social justice constantly, what are my alternatives in Singapore, right? Like, and are those alternatives really, would they actually do anything to resist or challenge unequal access in education? And I feel that working in an MOE school, especially if I found a job at an elite school, which I guess I would probably have done, because I feel that I can reach that. I'm better right now at bringing my ideas to that milieu. Yeah, I don't think that would make that would make me like less a more effective agent of change. So I guess my logic is that like it's definitely a problematic industry, and ideally I would have access to like multiple classes of students, and like from a mix of socioeconomic backgrounds and all that. I feel like given the very small number of students I teach, I am not playing as powerful a role in reproducing this elite class. And as a private tutor, not bound by the restrictions of the school and MOE, I can actively encourage the elite students I teach to act in solidarity with students who have who have much less access to resources. For them to, I can encourage these students to like seek out those voices, engage with them on social media, whatever other ways. But to remember that, but to make that a core principle of their praxis, and to learn more about like the inequalities within their own schools and their own complicity, how they can resist that. So I guess I'm in it because I don't see a better alternative. It's not ideal, and it definitely contradicts my beliefs in some way. But yeah, I don't see an alternative right now. Yeah.
And in some ways, I think that's much of the negotiation we each go through as we inhabit structures. I certainly feel that working in a university and thinking through what does it mean to do justice-based work, while being in a very neoliberal structure,
Yeah.
As we go toward wrapping up, I want to ask you a couple of questions. One is in terms of this question of creating voice infrastructures, right? What do you think are some of the specific ways in which uh, poetry, but also the pedagogy of poetry, can work toward building registers for voice infrastructures of resistance in Singapore?
Mm. Pedagogies of poetry in Singapore. I think a very good starting point, if we're talking about within schools, is to actually spend time, like at least one class, but regularly bring up the question of why the students are studying works by certain works by certain kinds of people, and why other works are not considered worthy of inclusion. So that's regular reminders that that voices and groups are being spoken for and not speaking within their literature curriculum, and in the poetry that they do, that they study. Yeah, I think that can be I think that's something that can still be done if teachers are willing to prioritize that, and not, and for a moment put aside the anxiety, which is the alleged anxiety about finishing the curriculum on time. So I think that's one thing that that teachers can do, like ways to call attention to, find ways to, even when you're teaching the canonized texts, to remind students of the context and the power dynamics of the text and in which the text was produced, and to and to link that to the concerns and the perspectives expressed by the text. So there are ways to tie it back, but and you do have to be very and therefore teachers also need to be trained to critique curriculum design. Yeah, that is, and I don't think that has to take place in NIE because they're not going to do that. So but if that was a bigger, that should be a bigger part of just discussion about education, like really close reading of close analysis of curriculum design, including the literature curriculum. Yeah, that could be a powerful form of resistance. Yeah.
Lovely. So, CNC, here's my last question, which is, one of the things I'm so amazed by is your ability to connect, to connect across spaces, to connect across issues, to bring together various ways of doing things, various activists. So I guess, one of the things I was wondering is, how do you sustain that kind of curiosity that sort of seems like is a driving force in sort of the work of solidarity building that you do?
Curiosity. Oh, I haven't really thought of it that way. I think first of all, I think it's also important to clarify that obviously I'm not obviously, but I'm not curious about every single person, and not to the point where I actually reach out to them. But yeah, but I think that one thing that sustains that is just I think maybe one way to put it is is humility, because I think that to sustain that curiosity requires a certain level of security, and not feeling like yeah, and especially as someone who went through like elite schools, not feeling um like I guess threatened by like people who know more, who have done more in areas that you wish you'd done more in, and to be willing to learn and listen, and to sit with like any guilt that one deals with when interacting with, when making friends with someone who, you know, who experiences marginalization that I don't. Yeah, and I think that just being willing to sit with discomfort, I think, is an important part of what gives me energy. And I don't know, I guess I feel like saying affection, but I don't really know how to talk about that. But it's just being able to like find you know, be I guess uh I guess delighted by people who like new comrades, and who you know, who also whom I can whom can with whom I can build solidarities, and who can help my, and with whom I can grow together, and also just and just really enjoying that process. Like, it's not a chore, and it's not, at least, you know, right now, it's not a chore. It's and I have quite a wide range of interests, I think, and I'm still developing new like interests and thinking through new things every year. So that gives me more points of connection with different people. Yeah, I think those are the answers I can come up with right now.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up?
Uh, mm, okay. I should say something. I think I guess I didn't actually talk very much about COVID-19, but I think for a lot of people who have the privilege of uh staying at uh staying in and in secure environments, who have the space to like think, and to really to be more attuned to the injustices and forms of solidarity, not just injustices, but also, you know, that are now a lot more visible in the media. I think people should really take this. They should, you all and we all should really take this time to think about what role we want to play. I recently posted on Facebook about something which I take as a key principle. I'm just like, learn about all this, but don't just like marinate in awareness. Like, take action, start taking action, so that in 5 years you won't look back and regret not having done enough, or not having done more. So I kind of keep my future activist self in mind as well. Like, I want to do as much as enough, so that I look back and I'm like, okay, I did my best at this time. I did my best to advance like social justice, and to amplify the voices of the marginalized, and I learned and I challenged myself. Yep, that's my last word.
Thank you so much. Taking
Thank
action. We will
you.
wrap up with that.
Thank you. Oh my God, I've been talking for 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.